Nous allons reprendre pour la suite de cette session avec deux interventions, une de Jen Leyden et puis une d'Angela Wanala qui n'est pas là et donc qui a enregistré une communication. C'est ce qu'on disait tout à l'heure, ça perd en dramaturgie le fait que ce ne soit pas en visio, mais ça gagnera en efficacité. Et ça évite tout un tas de problèmes techniques. Donc on est très heureux d'accueillir Jen Leyden de l'université Western Australia. Jen travaille sur, je ne sais pas dans quel sens on peut le prendre, mais tu me corrigeras, sur la mémoire et l'histoire de la colonisation en Australie, sur la question de la visualité, de la visibilité évidemment des aborigènes. Et elle a notamment publié The Flash of Recognition, Photography and the Emergence of Indigenous Rights en 2000, j'avais noté ça, 2012 je crois. Et puis elle a publié aussi Calling the Shots, elle a édité Calling the Shots, qui est un ouvrage aussi tout à fait très proche des problématiques à la fois de l'exposition et de ce qu'elle va nous présenter aujourd'hui. Et donc un des aspects importants de ce travail qui est exposé dans le catalogue, dont elle va nous parler ici, c'est aussi, et dont on parle en fait depuis ce matin, c'est aussi la question du numérique et de la manière dont ça invite à repartager autrement les images. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I too would like to start with some acknowledgements. In Australia, we introduce ourselves by through a politics of positionality. We locate ourselves in relation to our First Nations people, their culture and history. So I live and work on the traditional country of the Whadjuk Noongar people in the southwest of Western Australia, and the broader collectivity of Noongar people that make up Noongar Nation is perhaps one of the largest in Australia. I'm also going to talk about photographs and nations, First Nations from other parts of Australia, including the traditional country of the Kulin Nations in southern Victoria, now called Melbourne, the people of the Sydney region, the Eora people, northern New South Wales, and so on and so on. So I'll try and identify those as I go along. I'd also like to acknowledge the organisers of this event and the exhibition. I'm very honoured and privileged to be able to be here in person. So thank you to Christine, Annabelle and Anna and their team. And yet more thank yous. So this work derives from a number of collaborations over many years. I've been based in Western Australia for around 10 years, and since that time I have tried, rather than lead and speak for these histories, I've tried to create a space for First Nations colleagues, such as my very close collaborator Donna Oxenham, who you see here, who is a Yamatji woman and more widely connected across Western Australia. So I want to start by talking about some of the earliest photographs produced of First Nations Australian people. So this is from a series produced by Douglas Kilburn in Melbourne, or Naarm, in the late 1840s, so around a decade after invasion. This daguerreotype series, as I say, is among the earliest known from Australia, and they represent very dignified portraits. So if we look at this in detail, we see the sitter's life stories emerge. We see traces of tradition, such as the incised possum skin cloak the older man is wearing. These are his ancestral designs scraped into the skin side of the cloak. We see his ritual scars, scarification on his chest, and you can see that they cover his chest, they're well healed. He's a senior man, he's been through all the ceremony. The younger man, you see the scars are fresh and shiny and quite new and incomplete, so he has only begun this process. You can see that the child is wrapped in a blanket instead of a cloak. So this combination of old and new speak to people undergoing change and a process of intercultural interaction. So as we know, culture is not frozen in time, but is constantly changing and intercultural. This is another in the series, and again, we see these these details of people's biographies emerge. The pierced septum or nose, but instead of a kangaroo bone, we see the stem of a clay tobacco pipe pushed through the nose. We see the traditional reed necklace, but again, instead of a possum skin cloak, a blanket, and these very raggedy clothes are worn instead, as well as the implements such as the boomerang. But of course, as we know, only one or two people could view a daguerreotype at once, so the audience was very small. The polished metal plate has to be angled to the light, it has to be interpreted, so very limited audience. But of course, when it was translated by artists, for example, in this watercolour series, the audience started to grow and the image circulated more widely. But its message changed also. So we move away from the dignified, very specific portrait to see elements drawn into an increasingly stereotypical kind of representation. So this develops again when the image is published in books in the form of an engraving based on the photograph. So here the specificity of the daguerreotype becomes almost like a cartoon. And it's framed by the text, which is a guide to emigrants, William Westgarth's Australia Felix, where the message is, come to Australia, there is land here for the taking, the people are primitive and they won't get in your way, essentially. So here, as you can see, the image is not working for First Nations people, it's working against them, against their interests and against their objectives. So I think it's important to remember this history of transformation when we talk about digitisation. So we've witnessed a digital revolution in the last 20 years, but we have to see that in the context of a much older media transformation. And this, of course, determines the ways that these images are circulated around the world and the impact that they have. So I want to speak a little bit about the context for interpreting these images now. Australia is a former settler colony, and we are still what Indigenous intellectual Aileen Moreton Robinson calls a post-colonising nation. Through that term, she intends to convey the fact that we are still colonial, even though we're changing. And I think this came up this morning as well in conversation. We're not a colony, but we're not post-colonial yet. During the 1990s, some major public inquiries really brought home aspects of our past to mainstream Australian society. So the inquiries, in particular, an inquiry into the removal of children under assimilation policies, which we now call the stolen generations. Another inquiry into the incarceration of Australian Aboriginal people in prison, was very powerful and made a huge impact. So gradually, since that time, collection managers, photograph collection managers, have tried to implement the policies behind the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, in managing these collections and acknowledging First Nations rights in this material. In 2017, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which we see here, was proclaimed by representatives from all Australian First Nations communities who gathered together at Uluru, once known as Ayers Rock in Central Australia. And so the Statement from the Heart calls for truth-telling, it calls for a treaty, it calls for a voice to Australian Parliament. So in November, we go to a referendum to vote on a voice to Parliament. So these are really pressing issues for Australians which determine how we talk about the legacies of our colonial past, and in particular these important photographic resources. So I want to give you a few examples and give you a taste of the different ways that these images have been used. So I want to start from with the Ngarrindjeri community of South Australia. The Ngarrindjeri traditional country is at the mouth of the Murray River, where it enters the sea in South Australia. So Ellen Trevorrow, Auntie Ellen, is now a senior elder of the Ngarrindjeri. This is a very old photograph of her from the 1970s, showing her with her basket weaving. But I'm now drawing from her knowledge and what she has said about these images. She tells the story of her relatives, William and Patrick Robinson Brown, and this photograph, when it was first produced, really stood as an image of loss. These brothers were taken from their family as part of the stolen generations, and the photograph records them after they spent the night in a prison and then were taken into an industrial school. And you can see that from their expressions, they're almost in shock. They were taken without their parents' knowledge, and the image was reproduced in a report by the school at the end of the year, saying, with the caption, "Fine boys doing well under the management of the industrial school." So it was used as a kind of propaganda for the government at the time. More recently, this photograph of the boys, when they were released from the school after they had reached adulthood, was rediscovered by a family member as part of their extended family. So this image, as Auntie Ellen explains, was a way for the extended family to rediscover, to recognise that they were related and to join together what had been fragmented family ties. So this image in particular stands as an image of connection and reconnection for the family. However, unfortunately, many of these images remain images of loss and cannot be recuperated. So this image, which was taken at the same time as the first one, you can see the two little boys, but they're sitting in a much larger group. So the younger boy to the left is their younger brother, Uncle Bob, they call him, and he was later rediscovered and rejoined with the family. He married a Ngarrindjeri woman and lived in Ngarrindjeri country. However, the little girl to the left, her name was Daisy, and she has never been rediscovered. So this remains a matter of pain for the family, and they continue to search for her while the older members of the Ngarrindjeri are still alive, before it's too late, in the hope that they can, again, reclaim her and she can be reconnected with the family. So I think in this series of photographs, we see both the recuperation, the reclamation of photographs, but also a reminder that not all these images can be recuperated, and that there will always be some absences and losses that remain as a result of these historical processes. So I want to move on now to a happier story. Again, this story is told by Shauna Bostock-Smith, who is a woman from northern New South Wales, Bundjalung Gumbaynggirr country. And she tells this about a very well-known 19th century Australian portrait taken by possibly the most famous photographer of Aboriginal people of the 19th century, J.W. Lint. Originally a German photographer, he took many very staged photographs of Aboriginal people and was greatly admired during the 19th century because he was considered to be very truthful but also aesthetically pleasing to bring these together in his work. And I think you'd agree that this is a very beautiful and dignified portrait of Marianne of Ulmarra. So Shauna tells the story of how she was researching her own family history, and she discovered the identity of the woman in the photograph, Marianne of Ulmarra. So Shauna talks about how this was a revelation to her, and how this distant 19th century portrait was transformed into her relative and into a flesh and blood, beautiful young woman, as she describes. She also describes travelling with her father and her aunties to an exhibition in regional New South Wales, where they were reconnected with family, with the photographs and with their country at an event held by the gallery. So here, this is Shauna with the photograph at the exhibition, and this is her father as well. So for her father, it was an even greater journey of reclamation, and he asked, he wants to be buried within sight of this place. And they tell their stories in this book collection, Calling the Shots, which you mentioned earlier. I want to talk briefly about the project Returning Photographs, on which I collaborated with 4 European museums, including this one, led by my colleague Christine Bart. And the idea was that we would work with the 4 collections based at the University of Oxford, the Pitt Rivers Museum, the University of Cambridge, the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, here in France, and the museum, then the Vulkenkunde, based in Leiden in the Netherlands, now part of the Wereldculturen. The idea that we had was that we would join together the 4 catalogues. This would be a research tool, but also it would help us return the photographs to descendant communities. So you can access this via our website, which gives you a lot more detail. But the project was the occasion for us to undertake detailed research with particular communities. This will be very familiar to you. This is from FileMaker Pro, and this is the kind of information that we had for each image. I think this one is originally from the Pitt Rivers Museum and its collection. This is an image from Western Australia. So you can see at the top there, collection, Pitt Rivers Museum, University of Oxford. We now make these accessible through a search function. You can search very simply on region, for example, keywords and so on. And we use this as a way of reconnecting with particular communities that had been distanced as the images were taken, were brought back here to Europe, actually. And of course guided by cultural protocols, which I can talk about in more detail later, which are very important. In Australia, we can't really conduct research of this kind without being guided by a particular ethical framework. So this example from the Pitt Rivers Museum, those of you who have been there will be familiar with its idiosyncratic layout. Its organisation is thematic, and it brings together, it conflates material from communities all over the world. So the Australian material is collected into boxes like this. This was done during the 1930s. So the objects, the photographs, which had been separate objects, were collected together onto cardboard sheets, as we see here. So in researching them, we had to reverse that process of amalgamation. We had to go back and try and disaggregate, take apart the individual images. So I want to look particularly at Tenbury, this man in the top left corner. We had to look for clues attached to the images in the collection. My collaborator, my colleague, Dr. Christopher Morton, the Senior Curator of Photography, was able to identify aspects of the images through these clues recorded on the cardboard sheets. He knew that this writing here meant that it was likely that these images were part of the original donation, the foundation collection, when the museum was established during the 1880s. We worked out that they come from, that the man, Tenbury, came from this area, the Nyiawong people, from what is today the border between South Australia and Victoria, along the Murray River. So this is Tenbury's portrait. We believe it's a copy, perhaps, of a daguerreotype, and you can see again, very dignified, very detailed portrait, very powerful. When we researched his life story, we found that Tenbury was a very important man in his own lifetime. He was a cultural mediator. He was highly respected in colonial society as well as among his own people. He was given the credit for ending violent hostilities between black and white. Frontier violence and warfare was, he ended that through his role in translating between black and white. And because he was important, again, his image was translated. So he appeared in the frontispiece to a major volume of work about the Aboriginal people of Australia and South Australia. Again, the frontispiece lacks the specificity and the dignity of the original. On the right, we see an engraving of his son, Warralan. So again, his son's biography had been forgotten, but this research enabled us to reconstruct the story of his son travelling back with Edward Eyre to Britain. He was presented to the Queen. He lived with Thomas Hodgkin, a major Quaker humanitarian, and he died very young and is buried in London. So these sorts of stories were, of course, of great interest to the descendants of Tenbury and his family. They have now been reclaimed and incorporated into new formats, such as this film that we see here. So this is a still, this is an educational film called Bloodline, which you can watch. It's designed to educate outsiders, but also to teach the younger generation about the culture and history of the Nyaewong people. So again, I think we see these images moving through global circuits, these visual economies, and being used by families in the present. So the emphasis has shifted very much away from what did the images mean when they were made to what do the images mean now? How is the past used in the present for the future? So another example. So this comes from Arnhem Land in northern Australia and a community in northeastern Arnhem Land called Numbulwar. So here my collaborator Dr. Wonu Vase from Leiden visited Australia with a collection of photographs that they rediscovered in their archive and journeyed back to this remote community. So this was enabled by digitisation. These were negatives that had never been catalogued. She was able to catalogue and to print them out, and then she took both digital and printed copies with her back to Arnhem Land. And you can see here, this is from our website, but these are photographs from her visit some years ago now. So you can see Wonu laminating, printing out and laminating the actual objects and creating a small exhibition in the local store. So this is a remote community and we needed to find a place that everyone could visit and access. And so you see people here engaging with them. These are relatively recent, so these are outside the scope of your exhibition here today. But I think this is also true in many Indigenous communities. More recent photographs are sometimes easier to access and very important because living people remember their own youth. So for example, one man was very happy to see his own childhood photograph and he would come back again and again every day and talk about how good looking he was when he was young and so on and so on. So these are very living meanings for people. Another example from northwestern Western Australia comes from the work of my colleague Donna Oxenham, Yamatji woman I showed earlier. So in 2017, she travelled from Perth, where we live and work, up to the Kimberley for a festival that was hosted by the Kimberley Land and Council, Colloque, an organisation that represents 26 different First Nations groups in the Kimberley region of Western Australia. So here's Donna, and again, she did the same thing. She was able to do this because of the digitisation of the images, but she also took up a printer and she printed out the actual objects. She also had images in folders with ring binders. So I think this is a point that is very simple. My colleague Michael Aird, an Aboriginal man from Southport, has made. He says, digitisation is crucial, but photocopying, when that came along back in the 70s, that was also crucial as well. So it's a combination of technologies that allow us to share and open up the archives with descendants. Oh, thank you very much. That's great. So that is what Donna did, and she printed them out. She made, again, a small temporary, simple exhibition. And she also sat with the old people and showed them the images. This is at Roebourne. So this was very successful. You know, people love to see the photographs. Sometimes they see remembered photographs. Sometimes they see photographs for the first time. Sometimes the images have new meanings that we didn't expect. So, for example, a Bari Jawa ranger, who is responsible for reconstructing and conserving the environment, looked at the photographs to see how the landscape was at the time they were taken, 100 years ago or more, because this is what they want to do. They want to turn the landscape back to the way it was. So, you know, these are the stories people tell. Lorna Hudson, another Bardi elder, she said, this was the best day for me looking at these old photographs. So for us, Aboriginal people, First Nations people emphasise the well-being, the good health that the photographs enable. So it's about bringing the past into the present and the living meaning for them right now. It's about breaking down the distance between the past and the present. And here's Donna. We wrote up some of this work in a book chapter, which this book you might be familiar with, that came out a couple of years ago, and Donna's sort of holding it up, very pleased. I want to finish by talking about a very different kind of use of these sorts of images of ancestral dreamings and spirits. This is a fantastic project called Phone and Spear, which derives from the work of the Mirka Media conglomerate from the Yulnu community of Gupawiak. So again, Yulnu people in Arnhem Land, and Gupawiak is another relatively remote Aboriginal community. So my colleague Jennifer Deeger is an anthropologist who works with the community and writes about the work they do together. And she talks about thick photography. Thick photography is where it has many layers of meanings. It's more than the images. The meanings are sort of accrete and pile one on top of another. They've published a book which is open access through Goldsmiths, so I commend that to you. And we don't really have a lot of time, but I'm not sure, do we have time to read this? Maybe just the first part. So the point here that Paul Garamawai from Mirka Media is making, he is saying that in the old days, Yulnu went everywhere with their spears. They used it, but also it was a sign of connections to tradition and to culture. Today, the phone, the smartphone, serves the same purpose. The phone has become, and the images, the photography, has become a way of joining past and present for the future. So I think this is quite powerful. So these are quite remarkable images, I think, that this is the thick photography that Jennifer Deeger talks about, where the images are changing, but they're still embedded in the past. They're of ancestral people and designs and images and the dreamings that still give life to Yulnu culture in the present. But they're also using phone apps, and they're sharing the images and using them and circulating them in new ways. So this is a new use of these images. So people talk about not showing images of the dead, but that is changing. And in fact, it's central to many visual practices in the present in some communities. So I think I will stop there. Thank you very much. Many questions to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. On va donc écouter maintenant Angela Wanala, pas très loin, mais très loin, donc en Nouvelle-Zélande. Je vous laisse lancer la vidéo. Elle est historienne à l'université d'Otago, donc en Nouvelle-Zélande. Et ses recherches portent sur la question du genre, de la race et de la colonisation de la Nouvelle-Zélande. Et elle s'est intéressée notamment à la manière dont très tôt les premiers habitants de la Nouvelle-Zélande ont su se saisir de la photographie. Donc voilà, ces travaux réfléchissent à ça, sur, comme je l'ai dit au début, la manière dont la photo leur a imposé un regard et la manière dont eux-mêmes ont su s'en servir.
Je tente mon coup. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Angela Wanhala toku ingoa, no kaitahumi airani aho. Hi everyone, my name is Angela Wanhala. I'm a professor of history at the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand. And my presentation today is on Indigenous people in the camera in colonial New Zealand. I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be there in person to deliver this talk. And I'm really sorry that I'm not in Paris to explore the wonderful exhibition that's been put together that is associated with this symposium. But I do hope that this virtual presentation or pre-recording will be of use and value in the rich and exciting discussions that I'm sure you're having as part of the symposium. So I'm really looking forward to delivering this presentation because, as I said, it brings together a couple of areas that I'm really interested in. The way in which Indigenous histories, particularly Māori histories in New Zealand, interact and engage with colonial visual culture. That's a part of a kind of broad interest that I have developed over the last few years. So I'm looking forward to presenting this. And in terms of the presentation itself, I'll be focusing in particular on the period after 1840, which is the year in which the Treaty of Waitangi was signed between the British Crown and Māori leaders, and looking to the early 20th century as well, as I start to explore ideas about Māori as holders of the camera and consumers of visual culture too. So I'm going to disappear from the screen now so that you can focus on the lovely images that are part of the presentation. So good luck for the symposium, enjoy the conversations, and I hope the exhibition is going well too. Thank you. So if you open a book on the history of photography in New Zealand, you will likely encounter this 1853 portrait of Caroline and Sarah Barrett, which is commonly cited as the first known daguerreotype to have been produced in the colony. It depicts two young Māori women, the daughters of a European whaler and his Māori wife, standing side by side in matching outfits and hairstyles. This image has attracted much comment from art historians and scholars of photography. Some have read it ethnographically, others have noted its importance as a commission likely made for personal reasons. Others interpret it as a beautiful family photograph. For the purpose of my presentation today, the Barrett sisters' image signals several things that I want to touch on in my presentation. First, it highlights the centrality of Māori as subjects of photography in colonial New Zealand. Second, it points to Māori consumption and engagement with photography, something that is beginning to be addressed in our scholarship. And third, it forces us to reflect on New Zealand's photographic scholarship. In many respects, depictions of Māori and their role in photography are recurring touchstones in New Zealand's scholarship. But this often overlooks two aspects that I want to talk about today. The first is the place of settler colonialism in the development of photography and its history in New Zealand. And the second is Māori as photographers. I'm going to spend a little bit of time briefly going over some of the historiography, and then I'll pick up some particular areas of interest to me. So since the 1970s, numerous books on the history of photography and its development in New Zealand have been produced. Many of the scholars engaged in this work are photographers, private collectors, and curators of public photography collections. Sean Higgins at Auckland War Memorial Museum and Athol McCready at the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa in Wellington have been particularly important interlocutors. The most recent addition to the field is this wonderful new book by Lisa Mitchell, a curator at Te Papa. Her book, Through Shaded Glass, offers the first history on women in photography in New Zealand and also discusses, interestingly, women as photographers. Mitchell's book is a really important intervention into the scholarship, but it does continue an approach in our histories of photography that tends to focus on the photographer and their work, something that's understandable when we haven't got deep histories of or stories of women in photography. Some of that groundwork has to be done by tracking the individuals and their work through public collections, and that's what Lisa has done here. Too often these histories pass over settler colonialism, though, one of the most important political and economic contexts for interpreting photography's development and use in Aotearoa. And I'll come back to that point in relation to Lisa's book later. Now, settler colonialism refers to a specific form of colonisation characterised by migrants permanently settling what they perceived to be new lands, which were often already occupied by Indigenous peoples. Settler colonists sought to obtain ownership of Indigenous lands and resources through a variety of means, including treaties, land purchasing, and sometimes through armed conflict. And all of those took place in New Zealand's history. Settler colonialism also involved the imposition of English law in the case of New Zealand and constitutional arrangements. And it also has cultural dimensions, inclusive of the power to shape historical interpretation about the colonial past. So photography has a part to play in the cultural dimensions of settler colonialism. Now, photography and colonialism are deeply entwined in Aotearoa New Zealand's history, partly because its invention coincided with the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, between Māori leaders and the British Crown, and which ushered in a formal colonisation of these islands. But because the origins of photography in New Zealand have been largely narrated through the identification of photographs and their makers, our early writers tended to frame that term colonial as a time period, rather than as a set of political, cultural, or economic practices. And that's something that I'm interested in exploring in a bit more detail. As photography is a global technology, and because it was easily transported around the world in the 19th century, the evolution of photographic practice in New Zealand echoes what happened in other locations. As in other settler colonial societies, Indigenous peoples were a particular focus of early photography in Aotearoa. And while it's unclear exactly when photography was introduced, at least from the late 1830s, itinerant photographers arrived in the country to exploit the commercial opportunities available in new colonies, like ours. Photography flourished in Aotearoa from the 1850s, and over the ensuing decades, Māori featured prominently in the colonial photographic record. More recent scholarship that focuses on photography in New Zealand has highlighted how the technology and its users were participants in settler colonialism. Photographs document the impacts of migration, settlement, and land transformation, but it also does more than document. Rebecca Rice has shown how photographs were used, for instance, to illustrate the advance of settlement and the subjugation of Māori after the Waikato War, which began in 1863 and ended in 1864. Imperial officers, active in military campaigns to advance colonial settlement, photographed roads and military camps, while imperial and colonial soldiers had their likenesses made in the cities. Soldiers' images were collectible items, sold commercially and placed into settler albums. Because war and photography are global phenomena, these photographic practices that I've just mentioned were not unique to New Zealand, and you can see an example of one on the screen here. Now, photography's commercial interests also aligned with colonial propaganda, especially as landscape photography grew in popularity from the 1870s. Such images illustrated engineering successes, the advancing tide of colonial settlement, and the as-yet untamed picturesque wilderness. Photographers were also writers and adept promoters of their work. Christine Wybrew has written about the Burton brothers, who travelled to remote places of the country to photograph scenery in the 1880s. And here's one of the examples from the Burton brothers of Mitre Peak in Milford Sound, a stunning part of the country, and you get a good sense of the grandeur from this image from 1889. The Burton brothers' accounts were serialised in newspapers, expanding their brand and their reach outside of Dunedin, their home city. In claiming new territory through image and text, photographers did settler colonial work as they, quote, mobilised and visually reorganised local environments in the service of broader settler colonial imperatives. But settler colonialism was a reality for Māori, and photography was an ever-present part of Māori life in the 19th century. Their images were taken by soldiers and surveyors, two critical groups in the advancement of settlement in Māori territories, and professional photographers captured Māori likenesses in the studio too, such as the full-length portrait of Te Ore, created in the Burton brothers' Dunedin studio in November 1869. It is not known whether Te Ore went to the studio by choice or was taken there by the man pictured standing next to him, William Adam. Investigating the relationship between these men helps us gain a clearer picture of how this photograph came to be created, as does an investigation of the wider social, political, and economic context of settler colonialism. William Adam was a farmer at a place called Waihola, situated on the Tairi Plain, which is not far from Dunedin. His nephew was the amateur ethnographer James Berries Beattie, who reproduced the 1869 portrait as a frontispiece to his 1954 book, Our Southernmost Māoris. Beattie spent decades, particularly in the first few decades of the 20th century, recording the histories and traditions of Ngaitahu, the predominant tribal group of the Lower South Island. His extensive collection of research materials, notebooks, and writings are held at the Hocken Collections in Dunedin. And today, Beattie's records are vital to the work of the Ngaitahu Archives team, that is the tribal archive team, particularly in their cultural mapping project, Ka Huru Manu, where they're taking many of the notebooks and the traditions associated with place names that were shared with Beattie and applying them to an online cultural map of Ngaitahu histories. It's a really amazing project and it's worth exploring online if you've got an opportunity. Despite the modern value of Beattie's manuscripts to advancing Ngaitahu cultural aspirations, his collection was amassed within a settler colonial context, and at a time when amateur ethnographers sought to salvage what they saw as the remnants of Māori lifeways by collecting traditions, stories, histories, and objects. Te Ore's photograph was created in this colonial context. The settler's colonialism saturates the photograph in other ways. Adam was a farmer whose livelihood was enabled by the dispossession of local Ngaitahu via the Otago deed that was signed in 1844, under which 3 native reserves were created, one of which was on the Tairi Plain near the settlement of Waihola, and Te Ore lived on that reserve. Adam's success was founded upon Ngaitahu lands as well as their labour, as he regularly employed local Māori on his farm, and Te Ore was likely one of those men, because as I said, he lived on the Tairi Native Reserve, which was not very far away from the farming settlement of Waihola. We could also interpret Te Ore's dress as a visual record of Māori adherence to European norms during an era of assimilation policy that promoted the uptake of the English language and other markers of so-called civilization. But equally, Te Ore may have desired to present himself in this way, particularly at a time when many local Māori leaders were beginning to engage in photography and go to photography studios. Te Ore was not the only Ngaitahu man to have his studio portrait made at this time. He wasn't the only Ngaitahu man to go to the Burton brothers' studio at this time either. But in doing so, he left a visual imprint in the colonial record, where in the textual archive, his imprint is far, far fainter. But because of photography's links to colonialism, some Māori were cautious about the reproduction of images, as there was awareness of what could happen to them once they were out of their control. Reproduction of colonial tropes were common in commercial photography, reflecting the collectability of Māori as photographic subjects. A carte de visite, popular from the 1860s and of a size that could be easily posted, meant images of Māori found their way into albums all around the world. Because of this, Māori images were an important part of the business for studio photographers in the colonial period. Those who neglected the mania for collecting what were called Māori heads or Māori celebrities did so to their detriment. Māori men and women were depicted often as ethnographic subjects in group portraits, in head and shoulder portraits, in full-length and three-quarter shots. And these images were of prominent figures alongside too the ordinary and the unknown. In 1900, a Māori man took a case to court claiming breach of contract against a photographer for allowing an image of his dead child to be published in a newspaper called the Auckland Weekly News. And this was after having expressly informed the photographer at the funeral to not part with a copy of it because of its deeply tapu or sacred and private nature. But the Māori father lost the case, the court finding that he had consented to its reproduction by the very fact of allowing the photographer to take the picture in the first place. In 1907, Te Whiti, a prophet and one of the leaders of the pacifist settlement of Parihaka, died. He'd always refused to have his photograph taken, as did his co-leader Tohu Kākahi. Ironically, their settlement was richly documented by photographers when these men were alive, and ever since it has been the subject of much artistic endeavour. Established in 1869, the settlement that you can see a view of here attracted thousands of Māori during the 1870s from across the country, many of whom had been dispossessed by the wars between Māori and imperial soldiers and then colonial soldiers in the 1860s. In 1881, their community was invaded by around 1,500 armed constabulary, some of whom you can see lined up here, who the residents met with passive resistance. In his obituary of Te Whiti, William Bork, a writer, wrote that he, quote, detested with horror photographs and prints in which the protruding tongue and inverted eyeball are depicted as symbolic of the Māori, end quote. While Bork has likely embellished this description with his own feelings about these images, Te Whiti did fear that a photographic likeness, if taken, would undermine his ability to control his own self-image. In this respect, Te Whiti was engaging in what Tuscarora scholar Jolene Rickard calls visual sovereignty. Rickard uses this concept to describe how contemporary Indigenous photographers are making, quote, assertions of spiritual and political sovereignty, end quote. Te Whiti was doing something similar because he recognised the qualities of the photograph that made it so exciting, but also dangerous. It was portable, collectible, and it was a business. Now, because numerous colonial photographers engaged in the commodification of Māori culture and people, New Zealand's institutional collections are full of images of unnamed Māori photographed individually in studios or as groups on location. The distinctive presence of Māori in institutional photograph collections is reflected in the many books written by New Zealand's pioneering photo historians. These often emphasise the photographer's achievements, to quote William Main, prioritising the intentions of the photographer and overlooking Māori perspectives of image making. And that's something I want to turn to now. Now, Māori rejected photography at times because of its colonial antecedents, but there is evidence that the camera was regarded as much a friend as it was a foe. New research by Jill Haley, for instance, has identified several photograph albums held in institutional collections that were created by Māori families. And of course, there are many more such albums in private hands. The 96 studio photographs in the Parata album, for instance, include carte de visite and cabinet cards, primarily of Māori sitters and mostly relatives. Lisa Mitchell, in her new book, writes of Maria Maxwell of Māori ancestry, who was gifted an album in 1882 by her Māori cousin, and it too features portraits of family and friends. So ordinary Māori are certainly engaged with photography on their own terms. We can see this in my own family. Sometime in the early 1890s, Robert and Jane Brown, along with their granddaughter Mabel, put on their best clothes and travelled from Maitapapa, which is the main settlement on the Tairi Native Reserve where Te Ori lived, and travelled to the city of Dunedin to visit a photography studio. Clifford & Son, as you can see on Robert's image at the bottom. All three, dressed in Western clothing, confidently stared directly at the camera. Ethnographic props are absent. Jane and Mabel were photographed together, Jane standing or potentially sitting proudly behind Mabel, who is herself sitting on a floral sofa. Mabel is holding a book attesting to her educational success. And Robert's studio portrait includes a nod to his Scottish father and his tartan necktie. His suit speaks of social respectability, something of central importance to someone of mixed ancestry, such as Robert, in an era when the language of racial science was popular and pervaded the language and social commentary within colonial newspapers. Not only did people go to the studios to have their portrait made and on their own terms, but Māori took up the camera as well. New Zealand is blessed with a significant number of contemporary Māori photographers and image makers, like Natalie Robertson, Fiona Partington, and Lisa Reihana. But who were their antecedents? A glance at our photographic histories tells us almost nothing about when and why Māori took up the camera. Art historian Nārino Ellis and Natalie Robertson explain that from the 1960s, quote, Māori began picking up the camera, moving it from a tool of colonial oppression to one for the recording of social movements for Indigenous sovereignty, end quote. And here in particular, they are referring to people like the Māori photographer John Miller. But the 1960s was not the first time Māori took up the camera. Between the 1890s and the 1920s, when access to the camera was democratised, Māori political, tribal and intellectual leaders were also pushing for a program of cultural revitalisation as a response to the devastation of the 19th century. One of these figures was the politician Apirana Ngata, standing on the left in this image, who with his great friend, the anthropologist Te Rangi Hiroa, standing on the right with the bow tie, and also known as Peter Buck, encouraged the use of photography and film to document Māori practices and social life. Ngata was an instigator and supporter of the Dominion Museum's ethnological and ethnographic fieldwork projects, which took place between 1919 and 1923. And Ngata hosted the final expedition in 1923 in his own home area, which is what this photograph here on the screen, it's also the cover of the book associated with these expeditions, actually depicts Ngata and Buck in 1923 on his home ground. The photographs produced from the fieldwork are explored in He Taonga Mana Uri Whakatupu, Treasures for the Rising Generation, a book that sets out how the expeditions were globally significant because they had Indigenous leadership, were community-driven, and experimented with new technologies in the field. Ngata and Te Rangi Hiroa regarded the expeditions as a chance to record aspects of Māori song and traditional practices for future generations. Their interest in anthropology was not uncritical, but they saw its potential and possibilities to meet Māori cultural aspirations. Now, the outcomes of the expeditions were multiple, and this slide just shows a few images produced from the fieldwork. So the objects, the films and the photographs form a significant collection at Te Papa. The fieldwork also inspired the creation of the Board of Ethnological Research in New Zealand, which Ngata played an important role in. They influenced anthropology's development as a discipline in New Zealand and had a foundational impact on the trajectory of Te Rangi Hiroa's future career. You can see him in the image on the left taking notes. He eventually became the director of the Bishop Museum in Hawaii in the following decade. The expeditions demonstrated too the importance of Māori participation in anthropology and the capacity of Indigenous knowledge to reshape the discipline. As Te Rangi Hiroa wrote to Ngata in 1927, Māori and Pacific thinkers, quote, should be in the forefront and not leave the bulk of the investigations to workers who have not got the inside angle that we have. They miss things that are significant to us, end quote. While acknowledging the work of non-Māori as collectors and linguists, for Te Rangi Hiroa anthropological theories were open to contestation and challenge. Ngata too saw the need for Indigenous leadership of anthropology and the social sciences, but the expeditions were also just one dimension of his larger vision to foster and enhance pride in Māori culture. Documentation and preservation, two keywords of anthropology in the 1920s, were, in Ngata's hands, the means for culture to grow and thrive, and photography was a means to help achieve this. Outside the world of anthropology, Māori documented social life through the camera. Between the 1890s and the 1920s, at the similar time period to when Ngata and Bach are getting really interested in anthropology and are starting to develop an interest in the techniques associated with that discipline, clergyman Hakaraia Pahiwa took his camera on his pastoral rounds, during which he recorded scenes of daily life on the east coast and the East Cape of the North Island of New Zealand. He depicted people at work, gathering food, and documented important cultural events, religious service, and domestic life. And in doing so, Pahiwa illustrated the diversity and richness of Māori life in the early 20th century. And here are some examples taken from Tairāwhiti Museum in Gisborne and the Auckland War Memorial Museum. So you've got young Māori girls at school in one of the religious boarding schools, and they were a common feature of early 20th century Māori life. We've got workers on a collective communal garden here in this image, a beautiful view, and a Māori choir associated with religious service, and also a landscape view of Lytton Point, which is on the East Cape, New Zealand. It's quite a difficult and inaccessible place even today, but this is, I think, a beautiful image or view of the area. A number of Māori women also took up photography. Ramai Te Miha Hayward, born in 1916 and died in 2014, started her filmmaking career with an immersion in photography, and the image of Ramai here on the left is from 1969. She held an apprenticeship at the Cuba Studios in Wellington in 1935, and then 2 years later she used a small inheritance to open her own photographic studio in Devonport, Auckland. By 1940, she'd opened a second studio in downtown Auckland. Lisa Mitchell has identified a number of other Māori women involved in photography businesses, such as Hinemoa Shepherd, who trained in her family's Auckland studio from a teenager starting in 1917 and continued to work in photography until the 1950s. Hinemoa and Ramai were preceded by Katarina Hansard, who ran her husband's studio during the 1890s, and also by Queenie Wirangi-Pupu, who also operated her husband's photography business in the late 19th century. Both Katarina and Queenie were married to settler men who primarily worked as court interpreters and Māori land agents, operating in two areas critical to settler colonialism, the law and the land. So these women operated these businesses, photography studios, while their husbands were away out of the district, dealing with interpretation in court and also involving themselves in land issues. These links between these men, their photography businesses, and settler colonialism are hinted at by Mitchell, but not really investigated in depth. And so I do think there's some interesting potential for exploring and deepening the relationship in a bit more detail between how photography intersects with settler colonialism, particularly by the 1890s, when we often see the settler colonial story in New Zealand linked in particular to a time of war and conflict in the mid-19th century. But settler colonialism continues well into the early 20th century through issues that are associated with land purchasing and the court or justice system as well. So just to conclude, Hakaraia Pahiwa, Apirana Ngata, and Ramai Hayward reveal the various uses of photography in Māori life: for experimentation, for documentation, to advance cultural aspirations as a business, as a profession, but also as an art form. Exploring Māori amateur photography, too, such as this personal album created by Kate Miria Johnson of the Chatham Islands, may help us start to see Aotearoa's photographic histories differently, and particularly so for Māori as a medium of self-representation, for instance, and not just as a form of exploitation or of commercial gain. Two common narratives in New Zealand's photo histories. Ngā mihi, thank you for your time today.
Alors, on va profiter du temps qui nous reste peut-être. Merci. Jen, pour parler, puis on peut, je pense aussi, revenir vers Céleste et Aston si on a des questions qui traversent ces quatre interventions. J'ai plein de questions, mais il doit y en avoir aussi dans la salle. Est-ce que quelqu'un veut... Voilà, je fais quelques remarques et puis je vous redonne la parole. Donc je me donne la parole. Non, je me disais, il y a quelques questions qui traversent un peu les quatre interventions de l'après-midi. Évidemment, c'est à travers ma grille de lecture. Non, la première chose, je me disais que c'était très présent la question du vêtement, c'est-à-dire de la manière dont on s'habille, dont on se donne à voir ou dont on force la manière de s'habiller. Ça a été prononcé plusieurs fois dans l'après-midi, la question de la dignité. Et on voit qu'elle change selon les moments, selon les statuts. Et qu'en tout cas, voilà, le vêtement, je me disais, peut être aussi une entrée possible dans ces questions-là. Et d'autant plus une entrée que c'est un objet, comment dire, en quelque sorte, qui accompagne la photographie, un objet occidental, colonial. Et je dis ça parce que je pense que c'est... Mais voilà, les interventions sont nécessairement courtes, mais que la photographie vient avec d'autres objets. En tout cas, voilà, quand on disait décentré, ça veut dire qu'il y a circulation. Il y a peut-être d'autres objets qu'on pourrait parfois agréger. Et pour avoir lu les uns les autres, je sais que dans les livres, tout ça est observé de plus près. Mais voilà, peut-être qu'on pourrait reparler rapidement de cela. L'autre chose qui m'a frappé, c'était très clair dans les deux dernières interventions, parce qu'elles portaient plus directement sur le sujet, c'est la question d'arriver à reconstruire du sens. C'est pas seulement... comment dire, se refaire un album de famille, dans le cas australien, dans le cas néo-zélandais, c'est aussi quand même redonner du sens à des objets qui l'ont perdu. Et je me disais que c'était très proche de ce qu'on vit dans les musées en ce moment, avec la question des restitutions. On se rend compte finalement, on est parlé avec des conservateurs centrafricains il n'y a pas très longtemps, que voler un objet, c'est grave. Piller un objet et voler un objet, c'est grave. Et se l'approprier, c'est grave. Mais c'est surtout le sens qui est perdu, qui est beaucoup plus grave, parce qu'on peut toujours récupérer l'objet. Voilà, les restitutions, ça existe. Le sens, parfois, est vraiment perdu. Et voilà. Et donc là, je me disais que les photos sont parfois le moyen de redonner du sens. Et puis aussi, il y a plein de moments, on est devant des photos où le sens est aussi perdu. Et dernière chose... c'était évidemment la question du refus de la photographie, des esquives. On a vu ça avec Céleste, la question des refus, des peurs. On en a finalement peu parlé, mais c'est quelque chose d'assez connu. Il y a eu plusieurs travaux sur la peur de la photographie. Mais voilà, c'est l'attitude face à la réponse faite à la photographie et les configurations qu'elle permet de saisir est une chose qui me paraissait importante. Je ne sais pas si vous avez envie de revenir sur ces points, peut-être Jane, ou s'il y a des questions dans la salle.
Thank you very much. So many interesting questions that you've raised.
Le micro, peut-être juste The microphone.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So.
Thank you.
So and I'm not sure whether Angela wishes to go ahead. If she's. Oh, she's not. Okay. Thank you. That resolves that. So, the third question I didn't quite catch, but you were saying that as Celeste spoke about earlier today, there's a kind of fear of photographs, and this idea that is very familiar to us of the photograph and the photographer as predatory. But this is raising, but my paper and Angela's, I think both raise the issue. I think Angela actually quoted a colleague who talks, a Maori colleague who talks about the camera as friend. So very much transforming that idea of the predatory and dangerous nature of photography. And I think this indigenous response very much exemplifies and expresses, or even leads the way, in a revolution we've seen amongst theorists of photography, which have also traced the transformation in the way that we've conceptualised photography. So that very Foucauldian kind of emphasis on the inscriptive power of photography as a form of surveillance and control, and an emphasis on the authorial or curatorial intent behind the image, to approaches such as Ariella Azule's, which emphasise the photographic scene. In other words, the way that we all engage with the photograph in the present. So that this is a very sketchy way of characterising a shift in emphasis, but in Australia, I think we have seen First Nations people change the way they regard the photograph from being something dangerous that they need to control or be afraid of, or something which is likely to be re-traumatising, to something which can help them reconnect with history and culture and can be a source of well-being in the wake of the stolen generations, for example. And I know those of you who work in Australian contexts like Annabelle may have seen this kind of shift over the last 20, 25, 30 years as well. So that's your third question. So I'm very interested in your comment about Central Africa and the kind of the theft of meaning as being something which is a crime. So I think, I suppose I've already referred to this shift in meaning, but these new meanings, I think, come from Aboriginal people. So in a sense, these are not new meanings, but these are stories and meanings that stem from tradition and experience in the present, which I think is a slightly different thing. And then the first question about clothes and other objects, I think that's really very perceptive and something which is endlessly interesting to the First Nations people who are connected to the photographs, but also to us in the present. So many artists, First Nation artists, use these photographs as a source of information. For example, the possum skin cloaks with the design. There are Kuris from Victoria who are using those images to then reproduce in their own practice, and a range of other forms of material culture that again have been reclaimed and brought back into living tradition. So that's very true.
Thank you. Aston, ou peut-être qu'il y a d'autres questions?
Question?
Ah, okay, excuse me.
Hello. Thank you, Jane, for that really, really fascinating. Hello.
Sorry, the lights. Okay, hi.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, well, thanks.
So I was really interested in the anecdote that you shared initially about digitization and the caution about digitization. I found myself at one point in a conference pre-pandemic arguing almost against digitizing African archives for fear of, folks not traveling to the archives any longer and sort of cutting off the life's blood of some of these really important sources. So I was really taken by that. That was sort of your take on it. And so I have three different questions. One, a clarification, and then the other is kind of a sequence of that. First, when you talk about the return of these images, these photographs, I'm wondering, and this is sort of a hard question, were the originals, right, the originals returned? And then kind of following from that, why do you think the project is possible in this age of repatriation and digitization? And then sort of following from that as well, how do you think the project kind of either circumvents or confronts the questions that oftentimes stall out other kind of similar efforts, if that makes sense? Does it?
No, could you be more specific? So what kinds of questions?
Well, I think in terms of like ethical questions of return, right? So in this case, I think it's interesting because the photos were taken, right, in two different ways, both taken as in snapped, but also taken as in taken away, right? And so in the process of return, I think that there's a way that you're involving the individuals, but then it's also very much recording and also researching as well. So there's like a more of like a exchange, I guess, there of both information, but also of the images themselves. So it's a really kind of a complicated way that the project is kind of functioning and working. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, sure. So I think just to clarify as well, the range of examples I gave, some of those came from our Returning Photos project, and some came from a wider field of work in this area. So it's by now a very well-established field of research, and there are many people working in many different ways to return them. And I was talking to a colleague just recently about the way that when we talk about these projects, we talk about the successes, we talk about the positive outcomes, we don't talk about the dead ends and the problems and the kind of silences that remain as a rule. So, you know, I think that sometimes it appears a little bit more seamless than the research process actually is. But there was no one way of proceeding. What I didn't really talk about, that I didn't have time to really, is the ethical framework for this research. I did refer to that. And from the beginning, our project was guided by cultural protocols. At that time, so this is going back now to, I think we were first funded around 2005, the first iteration of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which has now, there have now since been two further evolutions of that. So now on the website, there's a very detailed and comprehensive kind of framework for doing this sort of research. So I don't think I can actually reduce what it is that we did to just our project or to just one way of working. Some of the challenges for the Returning Photos project, which entailed working from Australia with 4 European museums, were that we were dealing with material from across Australia. So I showed the image at the beginning, which shows literally hundreds of First Nations communities, so speaking around 300 different languages. So this is very different from beginning in the traditional anthropological approach, where you begin with one community and you work with them over many years and you establish a relationship. So that would be characteristic, for example, of Jennifer Deeger's work with Miyaka Media, with the Yolngu people. So your third question about how we confronted questions of ethics, they were very much present from the beginning and guided, the way that we proceeded. In Australia, again, we have seen a shift from white researchers coming into the archive and mining the archive and the collections and using them for research, to now needing to get permission. So this is something that managers are imposing as well. It's not possible to work with these collections unless you have permission and support and can demonstrate collaboration with the community and the relatives and the right people in the community. So again, I began with acknowledgement of some of the people involved in the research that I presented today. First Nations people continue to be incredibly generous and supportive around this kind of research, and that is really what makes it possible. So your second question, why is it possible in the age of repatriation? I'm not quite sure I understood the question there. Sorry. Could you maybe rephrase that?
So I guess it's a question around how conversations around repatriation may have informed this project and the impetus for this project. Like, what is it about this time that makes this project really prescient?
So the Returning Photographs project, the funding ended some years ago. The website's still going. People continue to use it and to research it. So a Noongar PhD student is currently using the archive in the present. But I see it as a historical project, first of all. It became possible because new research in different places around the world, I think, really began to examine these historical photographs as a source of history and culture. I would see the return of photographs, particularly, as following along behind the more high-profile repatriation of human remains and secret sacred material. I think this has really dominated the landscape of return in Australia, and in fact, we use the language of repatriation, which, as many people have pointed out, is not really suitable for talking about photographs, which are really endlessly reproducible. I think that also leads us to your first question, which is about, do we return the originals? Some people would say, what are the originals? Are they the negatives? Are they the first prints? Are they particular prints that are stored in particular historic places? The Aboriginal people, the relatives that we've worked with, they focused on the digitised and printed versions that were given back to them. And this is a question which has just started to be asked, actually, over the last decade by many people now. And I think it's really a question for the holding institutions, perhaps. Do they, they continue to own the objects that we have talked about, which our project Returning Photos has made available in a digital form. And I guess that's a question for the people who come from those communities, which they haven't asked for, actually. So I think I can't answer that question, but I agree it's a very good one. And I have no doubt that, again, following along in the wake of the repatriation of human remains and secret sacred material, no doubt that will become pressing for photograph managers as well.
Merci. Thank you. Est-ce qu'il y aurait d'autres, encore quelques minutes? Est-ce que vous auriez d'autres, vraiment quelques minutes, hein, très, très rapide, me dit-on? Donc une dernière question.
Oui, merci. Je vais la formuler très très rapidement. Merci beaucoup, et en français. Merci beaucoup pour les interventions. J'ai trouvé passionnant en fait de voir aussi la progression de la réflexion cet après-midi, et ça m'a surtout rappelé une expérience que j'ai eue dans le cadre d'un projet de numérisation de films coloniaux, de propagande coloniale belge auquel j'avais participé il y a quelques années. Et le projet initial, c'était de restituer ce coffret de films de propagande aux anciens territoires colonisés, donc le Congo, le Rwanda et le Burundi, pour célébrer le 50e anniversaire de l'indépendance. Et le geste, ce qui a été surtout très intéressant pour moi, c'était d'observer que finalement cette restitution avait été refusée par le gouvernement, qui considérait que c'était des images coloniales belges et qu'elles n'avaient rien à voir avec le Congo. Et donc, dans cette idée d'une restitution, en fait, c'était, voilà, ce refus-là, je l'avais trouvé extrêmement intéressant à interroger, et qui, du coup, souligne aussi la différence entre des images d'archives prises dans un certain contexte politique et idéologique qui sont très différentes des exemples qui ont été évoqués précédemment, où il y a véritablement une réappropriation de la prise d'image, de la mise en scène de soi-même, etc. Ouais.
Merci.
Thank you.
Ouais. En fait, je pense que c'est pas vraiment une question, c'est une très bonne conclusion, et je vous en remercie. Donc on s'arrête là, hein, c'est ça. Il faut, voilà. Il y a un autre événement qui suit, et donc suite du colloque, visite, et puis suite du colloque demain. Peut-être je vous laisse annoncer plus précisément la visite. J'ai pas les informations techniques. Vous non plus, bon.
Oui, donc tout de suite, on a prévu une visite de l'exposition. Donc on peut se retrouver directement dans le hall du musée, devant l'accueil adulte pour récupérer des audiophones. Oui, c'est ce que je veux dire. Et merci à tous, et sinon ce sera rendez-vous demain à 10h. Merci.